I see the GCC and others increasing warming up to Iran. Last month, Saudi Arabia extended an invitation to Foreign Minister Zarif. Last week, the Emir of Kuwait made an official visit to Iran. It seems that President Rouhani may have been invited to the Egyptian president's inauguration ceremony. These are just a few examples, but it seems that Iran's international and regional isolation may be quickly melting away as the anticipation of a deal accelerates. What's motivating the Gulf leaders to engage Iran, especially after listening to your description, Ambassador Ross, about their concerns, which, while the nuclear deal is something that was really concerned about their regional designs, in terms of engaging the Iranians, is this hedging? Is it, and if it's so, well, what does that stem from?
First, I think we probably have to distinguish between some of the different actors in the region on the Arab side. The Saudi willingness to at least invite Zarif to come, by the way, he has not come yet, I would read that through a very careful lens. They may be prepared to talk to him, but I don't see any sign that the Saudis are about to somehow change their behavior towards the Iranians. Having a conversation with Zarif might be designed to sort of, impose a set of principles that if the Iranians want to see any improvement with the Saudis, this is what the Saudis require. And there's a lot of indication that's kind of what the message has been. Or B, it could just be to draw, to see if there's any information they can acquire out of this kind of an exchange. But I don't see the Saudis at this point, certainly not with this king, who is very clear on his view of the Iranians. I don't see a change there. In the case of Kuwait, historically, the Kuwaitis had a different kind of relationship with the Iranians. They tried to be somewhat more in between, and they view the Iranians as a potential threat. They lined up more with the Saudis and the Emiratis in terms of their attitudes in the past year when they uncovered what was a plot within Kuwait. But I suspect right now the more traditional instinct to at least hedge bets, or at least try to minimize, give the Iranians a reason to reduce reasons for hostility, I think that probably accounts for it. In the case of Egypt, I think Egypt's focus is much more internal than anything else. They're not going to do anything with Iran that would upset the Saudis. The Saudis are their principal bankers right now. That's their main focus. I think inviting the Iranians to the inauguration is more a sign of trying to demonstrate a broad participation with regard to that event. But I don't see, if you're talking about Oman has always had a different relationship with Iran. Qatar also has always tried to hedge its bets.
So you don't see a hedging of bets?
Sorry?
You don't see a hedging of bets?
Not right now. Not by the Saudis.
Okay. So in this context, there are voices that I consistently hear, some in the Congress, others from beyond the Congress, who suggest that striking the nuclear deal with Iran is opening the doors to a much wider set of possibilities. As I listen to your collective testimony, it seems to me it doesn't open the door to a much wider set of possibilities of engaging Iran in a way in which they'll change particularly the asymmetric efforts that they have within the region and beyond, but will actually fuel the possibility for them to pursue a course of action that they already determined is in their interest. Is that a fair statement?
Certainly the way I read it. What I was trying to get at was, it may well be that Rouhani and Zarif represent a constituency within Iran that would like to end Iran's isolation, would like to normalize relations, see that the best way to support the future of the Islamic Republic is in fact to have a greater normalization. Now, obviously there's a different Supreme Leader, I think, operates on a different premise. Somehow he was persuaded to give Rouhani a license to negotiate because the costs of isolation, the costs of the sanctions, was seen as potentially threatening the Islamic Republic itself. But for him, he views us through a lens of hostility. He allows the IRGC Al-Quds forces to be their action arm throughout the rest of the region. There's no indication that Rouhani or Zarif have any impact on what the Iranians are doing throughout the rest of the region. And that's what I was trying to suggest. If you want to try to see a constituency that seems more pragmatic to have greater authority and somehow greater empowerment, the way to do that is to show the high costs of the behaviors that are unacceptable throughout the rest of the region. And I would also say, the only way he's going to be able to sell the Supreme Leader on the kind of deal that is required, by the way, the outlines of which I completely agree with, what you presented, that's what is required for us to have a deal. I don't think, the reason I say I don't think a deal is likely, Scott thinks a deal may happen. Here I would say I'm more dubious. I'm not saying it won't happen, but it isn't going to happen unless there's an understanding that they get no relief on sanctions. They get no economic benefit unless, in fact, they roll back their program. Their approach to the negotiations right now is we'll do some semblance of transparency and we should be able to add to the rest of the program. I don't believe there'll be a deal under those circumstances.
Let me ask you all this, and I'd like to have your opinion. Former CIA Director General David Petraeus said in an op-ed published in the Washington Post, and I quote, "Rather than freeing Washington to reduce the U.S. footprint in the Middle East and focus elsewhere, a nuclear agreement with Tehran is likely to compel us to deepen our military, diplomatic, and intelligence presence in the region in order to help partners there balance against increasing Iranian power. A variety of steps should be pursued to this end: approval of additional military capability sought by Arab partners in Israel, a renewed initiative to integrate the Gulf Cooperation Council countries' air and ballistic missile defenses, maritime and air exercises to demonstrate U.S. and partner capabilities in the region, and sustaining and, if not augmenting, existing infrastructure and force posture there." That's a pretty significant universe of things. How do you all feel about that? Dr. Kagan, let's start with you.
I'm in violent agreement with that. A nuclear deal that lifts sanctions to any considerable extent will result in a flood of money, resources, intellectual property, human capital, and other things into Iran. There are companies and countries around the world champing at the bit to get into a potentially massive and extremely lucrative market. That will flood the coffers of the state. We know that it will also flood the coffers of the IRGC. It has been interesting to observe the behavior of the IRGC leaders and their statements as these negotiations have proceeded. Initially, they were very cold, very cautious, very suspicious, and very hostile. Now they are very supportive. They are constantly underlining their support for Rouhani and for what he's doing, and they are very clearly on board. And it is the behavior more of people who believe that they are really going to get something out of this than people who have been simply told by the Supreme Leader to get in line. So I think the assessment that the Iranian threat in the region will grow enormously is absolutely spot on, because I think Ambassador Ross has really hit it. I'm not as sure that in strengthening Rouhani per se is going to achieve our interests. I'm very confident that until and unless the strategy that Qasem Soleimani has been pursuing is shown to be bad for Iran and bad for the Supreme Leader in some way, the Iranians will continue to double down on that strategy.
Mr. Medell, do you have any views?
I would tend to agree. I think that with the influx of cash, it comes as a result of a deal. And first of all, I'd like to clarify that I think that the world will be presented with a deal. I don't know how good the deal is going to be, because every indication I have is that Iran doesn't have any true intentions of actually honoring its obligation that's been very clear since the November agreement to actually come clean on the military dimensions of its program, which, as far as we know, in the latest IAEA Board of Governors report, at the present time, they're not actually implementing the additional protocol, and they haven't answered a lot of the fundamental questions about the military dimensions of the program, the most troubling aspects of the program. So whatever that deal is, we have a very, very long way to go before we can actually call it a comprehensive deal. But to the extent that Petraeus pointed out that there's going to be an enhanced focus on the Middle East, I couldn't agree more, because the necessity of coming up with a comprehensive verification and compliance regime is going to demand even greater focus on all of the things that Iran does to evade sanctions. And a lot of those mechanisms are in the region. And a lot of the ways in which they would potentially cheat on any type of a nuclear deal, which I believe is very likely, which they basically obligate us to actually sort of double up our resources in figuring out what they're doing. I would also, as far as going back to the GCC issue, I want to make one comment. I think that I very much agree. I think that there is, behind the charm offensive, I think when you talk to the Saudis and you talk to the Kuwaitis and others, I think they see through it. I think there is too much scar tissue over the last 30 years for them to simply embrace Iran. I think the existence of Hezbollah of the Hijaz years ago, which was used by Iran to attack targets in Saudi, the existence of other Hezbollah entities that were backed by Iran that are well known in the Gulf, left them with a very permanent, lasting impression that Iran has broader regional goals that are contrary to their own. And they are going to continue to focus on their internal security, and they'll keep Iran at bay to the extent they can. So I agree with the idea that there was going to have to be a greater focus on the Middle East, and there's going to be no pivot away from it.
Mm-hmm. I support what Petraeus was suggesting. The only difference I would have is I wouldn't wait until after the deal. I'd do it now.
Yeah.
I try to do each of those things now, and I think, again, it makes a deal more likely.